To the student of philosophy, the beginning student of philosophy, reading Plato is often an underwhelming experience. Unless you're interested in moral theory or the beginnings of moral theory, Plato is often, let's say, difficult. Difficult because you don't get that much that's clear. In terms of what you want in metaphysics, what you get is really like a set of breadcrumbs. It's breadcrumbs that seem to lead to no particular place. So it's an unsatisfactory experience. And I suspect that's one reason why sometimes one has to wait a long time to get any introduction to Plato that is not simply, or doesn't simply seem, a gigantic letdown. The normal view that comes out of that underwhelming experience is often given to students as a kind of unsatisfactory two-worldism, that there are two worlds. There is the world of forms, and there is then a world that we inhabit somehow. And this two-worldism is really, to almost everyone's immediate mind, an underwhelming thesis. Because if there really are two realms, two worlds, like this, an above and a below, how are they related to one another? How do they connect to one another? Well, they can't really, without forming a unity in those two worlds. So two worlds becomes a sort of two separate existences, and then it becomes a complete mystery how they're supposed to be related to one another. And that means it's a mystery what one is meant to say about the connection between the forms and this world. It leads immediately to a kind of skepticism. Now, many people have had that experience, that feeling of dissatisfaction with this view of Plato that seems to come out of the dialogues. But against this, there is something else. And that something else suggests a different view in Plato. This something else, this secret doctrine, is indicated in a number of sources. And it leads us away from the dialogues, which can seem then not to express really anything really of Plato's fundamental ideas. It leads us away from the dialogues to other sources of ideas about Plato's view. The first of these indications from Plato of the fact that the dialogues may be unsatisfactory is contained in a letter of Plato. There are 12, I think, or 11 or 12 letters. I think it's 12. There are letters of Plato in which he makes comments. Not all of them are thought to be authentic. Some are thought to be forgeries, but this one is generally thought to be authentic. It's called the seventh letter, or the seventh epistle. Here is what Plato says in this letter, which might lead one to think that the dialogues are not expressing Plato's real view. He says, this is in this book, "No treatise by me concerning it," my real doctrine, "exists or ever will exist. It is not something that can be put into words like other branches of learning. Only after long partnership in a common life devoted to this very thing, does truth flash upon the soul like a flame kindled by a leaping spark, and once it is born there, it nourishes itself thereafter. Yet this too, I know that if there were to be any oral or written teaching on this matter, it would best come from me, and that it is I who would feel most deeply the harm caused by an inferior exposition. If I thought that any adequate spoken or written account could be given to the world at large, what more glorious life work could I have undertaken than to put into writing what would be of great benefit to mankind, and to bring the nature of reality to light for all to see? But I do not think that the attempt to put these matters into words would be to men's advantage. So, what are we then to make of the dialogues? They are not Plato's attempt to put his doctrine into words. His doctrine must lie outside the dialogues. This might make us think that the dialogues are really a sort of public advertisement for philosophy, putting Socrates in full view of the public to remind the Athenians of their shame in putting to death one of Athens' great people, citizens. But they have no other real function. They are breadcrumbs, really. They are suggestions for how things might be understood, but they are not the real thing. So that's one hint. The second hint is this. We know of this from a disciple of Aristotle named Aristoxenus. And he says this: at one point, Plato gave a public lecture, open to everyone outside the academy. This public lecture was called On the Good. So it gathered a large audience. But when Plato spoke, when he began speaking of what the good was, what he said contained things about geometry and mathematics and harmonies, but didn't tell this audience what they wanted to hear. They thought they were going to hear about the things that are good, namely money, happiness, living a good life, a virtuous life, that sort of thing. The sort of thing that if you were to give this talk today, people would still expect. Plato said nothing of that. And many people, says Aristoxenus, many people went away feeling very cheated by Plato in that they hadn't heard what they wanted to hear. But what Plato had said to them was about geometry, about mathematics, about harmony. And that is an indication of what his real thesis was, because a lot of the breadcrumbs that are left in or put into the dialogues do seem to lead us to something like an understanding or an idea that mathematics is important. All these hints as to the importance of the proof of irrationalities or incommensurable magnitudes, as they thought of them. All of that, and the ideas about geometry, the ideas about Platonic solids, all of this, which plays such a large role in the Timaeus, all of that is there mostly in sort of hints and suggestions, not very directly, not spelled out. But we are being led to the idea of the importance of mathematics for Plato. But where there is no real solid indication, except for the Timaeus perhaps, on how this is going to work. What is this doctrine of the importance of mathematics and geometry? And we know that it was important to the academy because we have this idea, or this reference that comes to us, that above the entrance to the academy there is this saying, "Let no one who is ignorant of geometry enter here." That suggests that the business of the academy was to a very large extent the doing of geometry. And I think that's right. Indeed, all through the academy, there were many important geometers gathered even in Plato's time, but it's likely that Euclid himself was there at the academy, and many people agree with this, including the important Thomas Heath, who gives in his History of Greek Mathematics a sort of a view about where Euclid came from, and it's very much clear to him that Euclid is really a late academy figure who, having written his work of gathering all the material from the academy that he can, writes his Euclid's Elements and then moves to Alexandria to teach and takes the Elements with him. And that's very plausible. So this lecture of On the Good is a sort of an indication that what Plato's real interests are not such as are stated in great length in the dialogues. Instead, they serve a different purpose, an advertisement purpose. And there's another hint too in the dialogue called the Phaedrus. Now, we don't get too much there, but what we do get is the idea that writing things down in philosophy is often not a very good way of doing philosophy, that philosophy is meant to be done by a kind of personal contact, by contact of someone who is teaching, who can advise people on lay out the ideas of philosophy and get some feedback from them, questions. So it becomes an interactive thing, but it becomes interactive not in the way that a reader would read a text, in which the text can't answer back to the student. The text can't explain itself in different words. Instead, in the oral tradition, the all-important oral tradition, which, remember, had been emphasized by Pythagoras also, what you get is a far richer experience. And I think many teachers of philosophy, standing in front of classes, will testify that you don't get philosophy across two people unless you deliver it yourself in person. And so this video series is really a sort of surrogate for being able to do this in front of a class, where the class can interact and understand and in real time get the feeling of what the teacher is saying. That's exactly what Plato thought should happen. And I think my own experience is that he's right about that, and many others would say the same. So where does this lead to? It leads to the idea that there is a secret doctrine that Plato had. It's also called the unwritten doctrine, or the unwritten dialectic, or however you want to say it. These unwritten doctrines, secret doctrines, have been brought to the fore by a particular group of interpreters of Plato, known as the Tubingen school. It's a German school. The Tubingen school of interpretation. And the main figure here is, well, there are two. There's Geyser, and there is also Hans Joachim Kramer. Hans Joachim Kramer, roughly in the early 70s. And Kramer's idea was that if you don't just look at the dialogues, but look at the external references to Plato's doctrines that come from Aristotle and others outside of Plato's dialogues, then you get a very different idea about what Plato was on about, and that Plato's secret doctrines are interesting, detailed, and are exactly what the student wants in asking for a laid out version of the ideas that you don't get in the dialogues. So, the Tubingen school gives an account of the secret doctrines of Plato. It was done for an English-speaking audience. Many of these things did not appear in English at all soon. Many of them still haven't appeared in English. However, we only have a very small sample of what the Tubingen school says, to our great loss. It was done, though, in English, for an English-speaking audience, by Findlay, Plato, the Written and Unwritten Doctrines. It's sort of the Tubingen school of Plato interpretation for Bostonians. That's where Findlay was. So that book is an essential one. You can get it online for free at where is it? Internet Archive. You can get the entire book. So Plato, the Written and Unwritten Doctrines, lays out a version, some say an unsatisfactory version, but a version of the Tubingen school's interpretation of the secret doctrines. What is the secret doctrine then, when you get to it? Well, one thing is, all of this idea of there being two worlds, of a two-world system that you seem to get in Plato, is all wrong. There aren't two worlds. The doctrine underlying this real Plato is that there are two basic principles at work in the universe, and they are called the one and the indefinite dyad. The one corresponds to a kind of monism, a sort of the whole, it's everything. In a sense, it's not difficult to understand. So the one is the first part of this pair, and then there is the indefinite dyad, which is sometimes paraphrased, and it seems terrible to me, but it's paraphrased as sometimes the small and the great, or the limited and the unlimited, or something of that kind. It seems as though the translation into English is not an agreed upon thing, and it may vary from which Greek author you're trying to translate, because there are many who speak about this who are not in Plato's lifetime. That indefinite dyad seems to encompass, well, they speak about it in Greek times in terms of numbers and the importance of numbers and the importance of small and great numbers, or the importance of numbers that are divisible. For example, ordinary numbers, in some sense, if you only stick to the ordinary numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then you don't have divisibility. They're not, when they become divisible, they become the indefinite. They become things which are capable of indefinite division, just as these irrational numbers that they had discovered. A line length is something which can be divided over and over and over again indefinitely. So the indefinite dyad comes, it seems, into this idea. So it brings in this idea, which again, as I've said, Plato continually adverts to, this idea of the importance of incommensurable magnitudes, of magnitudes in general. So we get that idea, and there's a missing text from Aristotle. It was available to his contemporaries, and it was called On the Good, and it was meant to be an exposition of this secret doctrine, this doctrine that was only given to those who were students within the academy, except when he leaked it out in this public, into this public forum where he gave this talk on the good. So Aristotle wrote on these secret doctrines in this lost article or paper or book. It may be a short book. And identified the good with the one, which Plato had also indicated as well. You get this indication in the Republic. the one is meant to be the good, and Plato has something to say about what that is and how that can be understood in his own terms, in terms of the forms. By the way, all of this is meant to be a theory, also not of this world, also, but the forms themselves. It's a theory of the forms. If you like, it's a theory of the form of the forms. So here we get something which is capable, or was capable, of making sense of this indefinite dyad and the one. However, we don't have it. What we do have is suggestions of what's going on and what Aristotle thought was going on, which are in the metaphysics. So there are places in, for example, Book A of the Metaphysics where Aristotle talks about this idea of this indefinite dyad and how Plato had spoken about this within his closed circle in the academy, and how they had debated it and how it had flourished. And one has to imagine that this is a debate with the mathematicians who were of a large number, who were there and who Plato most valued. So we have that idea in Aristotle, and if you wish to get a hold of this idea, probably the only real way to get a hold of the Tubingen doctrine in itself, in its own form, since, as I say, not much has been translated. There are translations in this volume by Nikulin, Dmitry Nikulin, called The Other Plato, published in 2012. That book, which contains a number of articles in English by Geiser, by Kramer, and a number of other important people, trying to give and understand this idea of what Plato was on about. Now, there are several things that are unsatisfactory in the way that Aristotle goes about trying to explain this in the metaphysics. And he also mentions it, by the way, in the physics as well. So the metaphysics and the physics give you something of the idea, but it's not a particularly satisfactory exposition. It talks about, in a sort of very clumsy way, about how everything is number, and how Plato talks about number of the forms in a way which doesn't seem to make any great sense. And I don't think many people can read that part of the metaphysics and come away from it thinking that they have really understood it. You have to put it together with other things in order to get something satisfactory. It seems as though, in terms of number, the only real numbers that were of importance to Plato were really what are called harmonies or harmonics, or harmonic sets of numbers. Those played an important role, and also geometrical dimensions. The line, Plato apparently didn't believe, according to Aristotle, in points. So the first thing he started with were lines, the indefinite line. And then for the 2 dimensions, there is the plane. And then for 3 dimensions, you have the volume. Now, these give you 3 levels of geometry which you can investigate. Mostly, of course, when you come to Euclid, you're dealing with planes, plane geometry. But there were also indications of geometry beyond that, even in Plato's own time, in 3-dimensional geometry. Indeed, the Platonic forms, the Platonic solids, I should have said, the Platonic solids are 3-dimensional forms, and they are meant to play the crucial role, as I mentioned in an earlier speech on this, an earlier video. These are meant to play the role of basic elements in a kind of fundamental chemistry of geometry that Plato has in the Timaeus particularly. So you get dimensions, and these correspond to basic levels in geometry, and you get harmonics, and the harmonics are what Aristotle seems to mean when he talks about how number is important. But the problem is, number doesn't seem to be important, other than when you have harmonics. Because harmonics, and this is not clear in Aristotle so much, harmonics come from geometry. So those numbers, the harmonic sets of numbers, are geometrical entities. They are geometrical numbers. And so the relationship of the soul to the body is meant to have a harmonic relationship. And that's crucial. And that's something you get to see a little bit of in the Timaeus. So one is sidetracked really a little bit if one speaks of numbers as though that's the crucial thing. It doesn't seem to be. It seems to be, just as it was with the Pythagoreans, that the crucial thing is geometry. And the problem for us is that we don't really properly understand Greek geometry. And why do I say that? Because we think of geometry really as all about Euclidean space. The Euclidean geometry is a geometry of Euclidean space. And we think of Euclidean space as given by lengths of lines. And these lengths of lines, this is all post-Descartes. Our view of geometry is really a post-Descartes view of geometry. And we don't quite understand, because of that predisposition, we don't quite understand what's going on in Euclid himself. Because Euclid's view is not really that. It's that what he is speaking of is not laying out the geometry of space, but he's laying out the geometry of figures in space. It is the figures that are the crucial things. The areas in the plane that are related to one another, that's his main thing. Now I can illustrate this a little bit in this way. Suppose that one has, for example, an ordinary triangle, right angle triangle, sides A, B, and H, where H is the hypotenuse. Then you know that, I'll put it up further, that just says the Pythagorean theorem, A squared plus B squared equals H squared. You're all familiar with that. That comes in school. And we think of that as telling us that the shortest that A plus B is shorter than H, and H itself gives us the length of the line, the hypotenuse. So it's a distance measure. And how we interpret the Pythagorean theorem is as giving us a distance given A and B. You can imagine that A and B simply are a Cartesian axis, and then H is the length across those two lines. So we get a distance from this picture, from this Pythagorean theorem. But that's not how the Greeks thought of this. And we don't understand, most of us don't understand how the Greeks did think about this. What they thought is this. Put it up closer. They thought that when you take the square of the hypotenuse, that equals the square of one side and the square of the other. It's about the addition of squares, the addition of the areas of squares. By the way, I'm sorry for my drawing on this. It's really obviously not very accurate for drawing a square, but you can see the idea. We have two squares here along the sides. These squares, if they were to be added together, would give this square along the hypotenuse. It's the addition of areas that's important here, not a measure of distance. So because we don't properly understand this, we don't really understand Euclid either. For example, we're never taught that this relationship between the areas of squares, one could just as easily substitute circles for squares. So for example, suppose we were to have that same triangle. Let's imagine that it's a 3, 4, 5 triangle. Okay, if you can just picture my distorted triangle as that. We have a 3, 4, 5 triangle, and we put circles on the sides for 4 there and 3 here. And the diameter of this circle is to be equal to the length of that side, and the diameter of this circle is meant to be equal to the length of that side, and the diameter of this circle is meant to be equal to the length of that side. So I've indicated that by the dotted lines here to indicate that's where the circle is meant to, whether it's meant to touch. It's meant to touch as lines coming from the points here. So you can get the idea. And same here. These dotted lines are meant to show you that the diameter is meant to equal to 3, 4, 5. That's the idea. Most people never hear that. They never hear that the Pythagorean theorem would just as well apply to circles. But it does. It does. And you may want to test this out because the area of a circle is just simply, well, you know it's pi r squared. So r is just simply half d. So it's pi half d all squared. And that equals pi on 4 multiplied by d squared. Okay? That gives you the first steps to proving it. Okay? This is for two of my subscribers, Bruce and Eli, who may want to, you all may want to, prove this yourself. Prove that these circles, that this circle plus this circle equals this circle. And I'll give you the starting point for it because it equals this as the first line of the proof, and then you just have to work that out. Not only does this apply to circles, it also applies to right-angled triangles. Sorry, not right-angled triangles. Take this as a right-angled triangle and take equilateral triangles positioned on the sides. So we've got this is on the 3 side, this one. This is on the B side. So we get 2 equilateral triangles here. The areas of these 2 triangles added together equals an equilateral triangle positioned on the hypotenuse. That's surprising, I think. That's astonishing. Why are we never told this? Why does this kept from us? Well, it's partly the strong predisposition in terms of what is called analytical geometry, the geometry that comes from Descartes, which puts this great emphasis on lengths. And yet, length is not what Euclid was really speaking about. He was speaking about areas. We misunderstand much of this, and we probably don't understand properly what Plato was speaking about, what his idea of geometry was. And I've been thinking about this rather a lot and have just finished writing a paper on just this subject, but that'll come out probably some other time, and in fact may never. However, this idea that Plato's idea of geometry is not something which we can immediately grasp means that we can't properly grasp either his idea of the indefinite dyad. If that's adverting really to incommensurables and into areas and to lengths, etc., what that means, this is a very difficult matter for us to interpret, and we may not get it. And indeed, I think it's one of the deficiencies of the Tubingen school and of Findlay that they're really not properly trying to understand what Plato's idea about geometry was. We are only getting a sort of a fraction of what Plato is really there about. And this idea may have disappeared later. It may be that subsequent authors did not have enough of an idea of what was going on in the academy itself, as it were, between the members, to properly understand, when they were trying to put it all together later, what the Platonists of the time were really getting at. And that is, I think, probably my view, that even though we have these, again, we have hints as to what Plato was on about, unless we understand his idea of geometry, unless we understand what's going on in geometry, unless we can put together the ideas about harmonic sets in particular with a geometrical background, this may always be something of a mystery to us, where on the one hand we have talk about number, and on the other hand we have talk about space and geometry and that sort of thing. But we may not be able to understand what it is. Harmonic sets come into the Timaeus, that's a big thing. So we know that harmonic sets are really important, but harmonic sets come from geometry, and that's less obvious to many Plato interpreters. And the way in which we get this idea about geometry and harmonic sets of numbers, harmonic sets of points, becomes crucial to how we put all of this together, because it unites then the ideas of the soul, which is a harmonic set, with the body, and God and the good and the other preeminent forms into something like a unified whole. And we, again, because much of this seems to have been lost in the Neo-Platonist period, although they were grasping for it and trying to put it together, it's not clear that they entirely managed to do so. They were trying for a mathematics which by that point was almost unknown, ungrasped. After Plato's academy, after Plato's death, after Euclid, all of that knowledge gradually dissipated. Even in Alexandria, where it held on for the longest, it gradually disappeared. And so the authors of this, the last author who was trying to revive this Greek mathematics was a mathematician by the name of Pappus of Alexandria. This was really the last gasp. And after that, we are trying our hardest to understand a Plato which vanished almost with him. So that leads us on then to Aristotle. And what we get in Aristotle is a very mixed bag, as we'll see coming up. Thank you.